Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Tidy Tea Time. And this time we're talking about leadership and vulnerability. I think there's a lot of talk about vulnerability in the workplace, vulnerability in leadership, in today's world. And in fact, it's a lot that I'm seeing on LinkedIn. In fact, about how it's coming to the fore again, about how it's important for leaders to show vulnerability, to show, I would not like to say weakness because it's not a weakness, and how it's actually considered a strength. There's a lot of talk about that. So let's jump right in, um, and maybe ask Kiran, you, to start with, what is your definition of vulnerability?
Okay, maybe I should have prepped a little bit more for this one, but I don't know. I mean, from my perspective, when you're thinking about vulnerability and especially at a leadership position, um, I would say it's always measured vulnerability because let
Hmm.
me just kind of caveat that before I get into the actual definition, because it's basically being open and candid about everything that someone else needs to know. It does
Correct.
not necessarily need to be about your personal life that you're kind of being vulnerable about
Mhm.
in public. It need not be, but as a leader, for me, it's important that your kind of workplace sees you as a vulnerable leader who's willing to kind of share where that particular workplace is at. So I think it's contextual when you think about it from a work perspective. It doesn't need to be that you're vulnerable on Instagram and Facebook. I don't think that matters, but if you can sort of be fairly open, transparent, understand everyone's situation, and then talk to that situation as well, or that particular context, then that kind of makes you a
Fair.
vulnerable leader.
Fair. Who wants to go next? Pooja?
Um, yeah, I think similar to that, it's. I feel like a lot of leaders feel like they need to have all the answers all the time because of the role that they play in an organization. There are certain pressures with decisions, and sometimes it's okay to not know all the answers and not pretend to know all the answers. So vulnerability in that sense is to be able to say, guys, I don't know the solution to this problem, but not just end there. Say you don't know, say I'm unsure, have that, be able to address the uncertainty, but also say, okay, if this is the problem, XYZ is the solution that we think that we can take in order
Yeah.
to solve the problem. So that is another example of vulnerability that I would use.
Yeah, I think that's a good one as well. Soumya? Okay, I think Soumya did mention she was having internet issues today. So we'll wait for her to come back. And meanwhile, I mean, I think both
Can
of
you
you kind
hear
of
me
went.
though?
Yes, now we can. Soumya,
It's
you
a
want to
bit
talk about
spotty, I
what
think.
is vulnerability for you?
I think there's a lag though. I really want to talk about this topic, but
It's okay. While we wait for Soumya's internet to start behaving itself, you
yeah,
know,
absolutely. I want to, but can you hear me though?
Yeah, yeah.
yes.
Okay, because of the lag, there's like you're saying something, she's saying something, and it's a bit off. I think we can continue now.
We'll wait for her to come back. Maybe once her internet is behaving. Meanwhile,
Yeah.
as you said, right, vulnerability, the word is tough to say, but it's one of those things, right? Like you said, it's the ability to say that I don't have all the answers. I think that is one very, very important part of it. And Kiran, what you said as well, it is contextual, obviously, because there is a fine line between being vulnerable and oversharing, I suppose. And there's a very there are many dangers attached to that as well. So knowing how much to share, but then it doesn't always have to be calculated, is what I feel, right? Because ultimately, I feel vulnerability is also about being authentic. It's about being yourself, being able to speak your mind to it as much as you can. And like for example, at Tidy, we keep talking about how we want everyone to bring their whole selves to work, every part of you. And I think that is being vulnerable, because when you bring that part in, we see you for who you are. We know why you make certain decisions. um, what could have held you back, or what is going to help you do more. That understanding that it gives your colleagues makes, I think, for a much better workplace, and makes for a more productive team, honestly speaking. I think being vulnerable, in fact, a lot of people are touting that as one of the things to look for in teams that work well together, is how authentic people are and how vulnerable they are able to be with each other, and how, when they're able to create a safe space, for everyone to speak up or speak their minds, right? But Kiran, I want to delve a little deeper into what you were saying, right? What does vulnerability look like for leaders specifically?
In my opinion, it has to be a little measured. Unfortunately, while being vulnerable, um, and if the reality is overly negative, for
Mm.
example, right, and you're being vulnerable, um, problem is you have to draw a line or to kind of figure out where you should stop,
Yeah.
because if you're giving a complete 100% transparent view, my question is, what happens when everyone sees that maybe extremely negative state, right? What
Mm.
happens? Now, I don't know. Maybe I don't have the answers on this one, but if I'm gonna say, "Oh shit," we're gonna be in such bad shape that we're shutting down in 10 days. If a founder or a CEO has to ever say that, um, how would the entire workplace take it? Right?
Mm.
It's a measured vulnerability that you have to bring as a leader, because you can't make it overly, I would say, transparent, but at the same time you can't fluff it up with a lot of cushy nice things. So I'm not sure how to explain it. I'm not sure what the right answer is in this case, but I think there is that need for sort of measured sort of vulnerability more than
Yeah,
anything else.
because I mean, this is something I wanted to ask, right? And I was looking it up as well. During times of, during uncertain times, so to speak, right? Is vulnerability a good thing or a bad thing? And most people seem to say that it is a good thing. It's important, all the more during uncertain times, to be vulnerable. Um, so, but do you
But as a
expect your
leader,
captain, as yeah, that's
yeah,
exactly what it is. Do you
exactly.
expect captain to say, guys, I'm not sure what's going to happen, I'm just as scared as you are, I'm worried? Or do you want your captain to be solid and say that we've got this, I'll get you to shore, come
Yeah,
hail or high water? There's
exactly.
that as well, right?
I mean, that's the whole point right now, using the whole ship analogy. It is the captain who kind of has to leave last, has
Hmm.
to make sure everyone is calm, getting
Yeah.
into the lifeboats in the most orderly fashion, is not kind of like jumping over each other, and then make sure everyone reaches safety, and then finally he or she kind of, you know, figures his or her
Yeah.
own life. So,
Yeah.
so I think instead, if the captain were like, "Oh my God, we're all gonna die, we're all gonna die, everyone, we're gonna die," that's not gonna help, right?
Mm.
And that may be what he is feeling or she is feeling at that point of time as a captain,
Yeah.
but you need to have some sort of restraint or some sort of boundary where you can't overshare. I think even in that leadership position there is a level of overshare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, we did speak about this topic in another episode of Tidy Tea Time, which was about soft skills and hard skills, right? And I think there's a lot of overlap here as well, because vulnerability, or being the ability to show vulnerability is a soft skill, and therefore you have to couple it with a lot of other skills to be a leader, right? So it's not
Yeah.
about showing panic when you are truly panicking inside, but
Yeah.
also being able to balance it out, to be able to be there for you, to show empathy, to think for others. As Simon Sinek has a book where he says leaders always eat last. It's the same concept, right? You leave last. So to be able to balance the way you approach every situation is, I think, important. We have Soumya back. Hopefully, we'll be able to hear her this time.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Before I go off, since we are talking about vulnerability, I have to bring in the name that I want to, Brené Brown. I
I
think the
knew
entire
it. I knew it.
conversation around vulnerability, all the concepts that we are talking
She
about now, I
defined
think
it.
it's step from there.
That's true. In fact, I was waiting for one of you to bring up Brené Brown. She's a sociologist. She's also a psychologist, I think. Soumya, do we have you still? Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. I think I stopped you in my excitement.
Yeah, I think so. Vulnerability for me, I think I left off from there. So vulnerability for me, and in terms of what Brené says as well, I've read all of her books. I have all copies of her books in my bookshelf. What she says is vulnerability is risking exposure when you know that people may or may not accept what you're sharing, right? I think that moment where it can go either ways. I think that moment is what vulnerability is all about, be it in our personal lives or professional lives.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And being brave enough to sort of push through whatever the outcome would be, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah,
think she
absolutely.
defined it as true courage, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
knowing that we're afraid, being able to share that afraid and fear, and then still push forward. I think that's what
Yeah.
vulnerability really is.
But then does it work for everyone, right? Because, some people are comfortable with being vulnerable, because your personality type also somewhere allows you to be, maybe you're more, you're more emotionally connected, or have more empathy, or to generally, have those personality traits that allow you to share what's happening deep inside and be authentic, bring your whole selves, all of that. It takes a certain type. Whereas there are some people who are just not comfortable with that. There are people who want to compartmentalize, for example, between work and personal lives, who do not wish to share, who want to get to work, finish the work they're doing, of course, work with everybody else, and that's it, right? So is that, I'm just wondering, if all workplaces encourage vulnerability, it's also about encouraging you to just be yourself, right? Not necessarily be like everyone else, and because it's the cool thing to do anymore.
I feel like there are, like, if you're a leader, that there's a very distinguished hierarchy within your organization, where like the boss sits in one chair on the top floor, and that kind of situation where you feel like you're very intimidated by your boss, and the culture around the organization is in that way a bit like tiptoey.
Yeah, right.
I don't think that's helpful. Like, so then your employees aren't going to feel like they can address any problems in the organization with the higher ups, or give valuable feedback that helps the organization grow forward, rather than it being detrimental to uh, the growth of the company. So if a leader that comes off as the boss, and
Yeah.
everyone else is below me, then that's an imbalance that really can cause a lot of trouble.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Which means, I mean, it comes, it is also something that has to flow top down. It's one of those things, right? Kiran, for example, right? If you say, are open to being, to sharing, or, you're okay to show vulnerability, do you believe that's something that, you're encouraging the rest of your colleagues to do the same? Is it an important part of culture building, for example, for you as a founder and CEO? Is it an important part of culture building where you're setting up a place where everyone's welcome to be themselves? How do you see it? How do you approach it?
I think, like you said, it's a topic that's probably not easy for everyone.
Yeah.
Um, and, I think all four of us here on this um, Tidy Tea Time today, all four of us are Indians. And if you think about the Indian mentality, it's not to be vulnerable,
Hmm.
right? You're always told to kind of figure things out yourself and not be too open and vocal about it, whether it's financial, health, physical, whatever it may be, right? You're living in a fairly I would say fairly disciplined environment most of the time,
Yeah.
most Indian households, right? So I think if you look at you know cultures, it also depends very much on the culture that you've been brought up in.
Yeah.
So as a CEO, as a leader, I can espouse vulnerability. I can, put it on social media. I can talk about everything wherever I want. But when it comes to culture building, I think it's good to show that you are open to it. But I think it would be very incorrect to expect it.
Hmm.
And so I think that's where you also need to kind of figure out how to manage different personalities,
Yeah.
because someone who's very comfortable being vulnerable will probably tell you a lot of their miseries and their pros and cons at work. But someone who's not is going to be closed up by default. And
Right.
so just by you showing vulnerability is not going to help that individual become vulnerable. But there may be a lot of things that are pent up. So I think vulnerability is important, but unlocking what people have in their mind is way more important as a leader than just trying to be vulnerable and hoping everyone follows suit.
Hmm. How do you do that though? How would you unlock what's happening in people's minds? Hussain?
I think the idea of vulnerability, first of all, by definition, is to unlock it yourself.
Hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
if you don't unlock it yourself, then there are other ways that people are hoping they can reach out to you and get that sort of what's in your head and what's in your mind. But as a leader, I think the main thing is you need to really sort of give that comfort that you're there, and if there is something that they need to speak to you about, they shouldn't feel like you sit in a chair in a cubicle on the top floor and you're not approachable, like what Pooja was saying. And it happens. Now, the other problem with vulnerability is you always expect repercussion.
Yeah.
And so, especially in a corporate environment, if there's repercussion and you're doing that right from the top, then that kind of seizes people in as well. So I think a lot of these things that you need to do is more important and more holistic than just being vulnerable,
Hmm.
because vulnerable is for yourself. But if you really want to do it for the others, then you have to do a lot more.
Right. In fact, I mean, Soumya, since she cannot contribute right now because of her internet issues, she says, I'm going to be active here today. I think in performance based cultures, the first step towards vulnerability looks like finding the courage to ask for help. Right? I agree. But also, what you're saying about performance based cultures, we've also heard this other phrase, and I'm, wondering if it's the opposite of what we're talking about today is fake it till you make it, right? We are also told this, we've heard this before. Um, is it the opposite of vulnerability? Because in fake it till you make it, you don't ask for help. You pretend like you know it all. You pretend like you're the best at what you do, and you keep going at it with such confidence that everyone believes the story that you're putting out there,
I
right?
don't know. I mean, it's also depending on who you're being vulnerable for,
Hmm.
right? Fake it till you make it is a great sales strategy.
Yeah,
right?
it is.
You don't have a single customer as a startup. You go over there, talk like you're going to be the world's biggest product, and the company has to buy you, and you
Yeah.
say, hey, I have 15 other conversations going on. That's not the opposite of being vulnerable,
Hmm.
right? That's just you kind of putting your best foot forward, being confident, being, whatever you do, whatever it takes to win that deal, for
Yeah.
example, right? But when we think about vulnerability, I think the biggest problem for me with vulnerability is it's a very individual activity. You can either be vulnerable as yourself or you're
Hmm.
not. I don't think you can force other people to be vulnerable. It,
Yeah.
in culture building, you can't force everyone to be vulnerable, like we
Yeah.
just discussed. It is a very individual activity. And so it really is contextual to that individual and that point of time. I may not be a vulnerable person in general, but maybe that one point of time, I just want to be vulnerable. And I say, oh man, I've had a terrible day,
Yeah.
right? But that may not be me in general. So it also doesn't define you as an ongoing individual. It could be at different points you want to be vulnerable and at different points you don't.
Right. I was just wondering how that impacts how people design work, for example, right? It's not, like you said, it's not something you can force people to do.
Yeah.
If you want that kind of a culture, then it has to start from leadership where they are, they show their human side. And I think also the other thing is the pandemic forced us into that corner, right? Where we had to, there was your personal life, professional life the line between got blurred so much that you had to be vulnerable. The whole, it's simple things like, having your children in the background on a Zoom
Yeah.
call, right? Answering the doorbell, things like that, falling sick, losing somebody, grief. All of these things came to the forefront during the pandemic. And I think that's why we're talking about it so much more today. And, again, these are some of the lessons that we have to keep continuing to take with us. And especially us, where we are, so deeply entrenched in the world of employee experience. What does that mean, right? One of my favorite CHROs is Lena Nair from Unilever, and she says that the soft stuff is the hard stuff, right? And she says that when she talks about how vulnerability is basically about creating a psychologically safe place for your people, where they do not have to work from a place of fear, right? Nobody does their best work when they're scared. And again, this is an interview that we did recently. We have a podcast called Extra Extra, and we interviewed Emma Bridger, who's an EX consultant, and she spoke about it as well. Your employees shouldn't come to work wondering, am I going to be fighting off a mountain lion or a cave bear today? Because that's not when you're at your best or when you will be the most productive. And if leadership can show vulnerability, that I'm not at my best today, it creates a safe place for the employees to say, hey, you know what, this person's human too, I can be human too, and there are days when I cannot do my best and the days when I can, and it's okay. And it also kind of opens you up to saying, I can make mistakes, that's very normal, right? I think that's another huge part of creating better workplaces where people can or have the freedom to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
And have dogs barking in the background with no
There you
problem.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I agree. I think, I think while it is an ideal sort of state to be in, to ask everyone to be vulnerable, um, I keep saying this, it's impossible to get everyone vulnerable in a workplace environment because there's just so much that an individual has to think about. You can try and help, you can try and kind of help their sort of, you can try and sort of encourage them to be vulnerable. But unfortunately, I think it's a lot more than just saying, hey, we are a workplace that allows you to come in as yourself,
Hmm.
because there is performance, there's the money that you get for it, there is benefits, there's your promotion, there are teammates, there are people you like, people you don't like at your workplace. So it's much tougher than being that individual who's vulnerable to everyone on social media, for example,
Right.
right? I
Yeah.
think it's much tougher being vulnerable at the workplace than it is to be that individual on your Instagram profile or on your LinkedIn profile, being vulnerable to just a blank audience because you don't see them, you don't work with them. It's not like you're interacting with them as you would at a workplace. So I think that's why it's a very challenging sort of I would
Yeah.
say, I don't know what to call it, but it's very challenging.
100%. I agree. Like, when I see on LinkedIn, there's so many people who talk about their personal lives. They talk about, their personal experiences, and it is inspiring and it is nice because, on a platform, for example, which is all about work, to see authentic, we all love a good human story, right?
Yeah.
Because we identify with it, we empathize, we sympathize. It speaks to us at a core level, right? And to bring that into the workplace kind of makes it more real. I feel makes it, at the end of the day, you feel like you identify and you belong more. I think that's the other thing it does. It creates a sense of belonging, that there are people who are like me in this workplace. So I think that's also a key part of, why vulnerability is so important. We have a couple of comments. Benita Elizabeth has commented. She says past experiences really do inform the future when it comes to vulnerability, especially in the workplace. Um, I wish I could get her to elaborate on that a little bit more. Maybe you can, Benita, in the comments. I would love to hear more. And Soumya also has written in saying, fake it till you make it. Can it be reworded as being afraid to do something and yet doing it so many times it becomes easier for you? Maybe it is just a more cognitive way of pushing you towards practice makes perfect. Is that true, Kiran? Would you say it like
No,
that?
not at all. I don't think so. At least in the sales context and the selling sort of side of the world, I don't think so. Um, it is, it is having that chutzpah to go out and sell something that you actually don't have,
Right.
right? And I don't think everyone can do that. It's very different. I think that's a different conversation altogether. It has nothing to do with vulnerability, but it's actually a very interesting conversation. But I think it is something that not everyone can do.
Okay. What about in a world of cutthroat competition? Now, on one hand, we say that it's an advantage to be able to be vulnerable, right? But Pooja, for example, does it make you ever wonder or make you feel like you might be at a disadvantage if you showed too much or shared too much about yourself versus someone else who's probably doing the same work you do, who might not be doing that, right? How does it feel like, do you feel like you're exposing yourself to criticism maybe?
I don't understand the question you're trying to ask me. I'm what is the
So does it, if you're being vulnerable in the workplace, for example, if you're sharing that, there's something that's holding you back for whatever reason, will you feel
yeah,
like you're putting yourself at a disadvantage compared to, say, for example, if a colleague doing the same role as you, um,
yeah.
probably is not presenting that softer side to leadership, to the manager? How do you think that is, does that affect your chances? So, if, for example, for a promotion, will it put you at a disadvantage compared to the others?
No, I mean, I feel like I've uh, always been somebody that's been a little more emotionally available. So
Hmm.
I, not oversharing, but if I'm not able to get my work done today, then and it's affecting my team, then I need to let them know that this is what is happening and this is why I'm not able to give my 100%. That's
Yeah.
the extent to which I'm not going to go into a whole spiel about why I'm in a bad mood or there are at different levels there are different lines that you don't cross, I guess, to show how vulnerable you can be. So, but I
Yeah.
mean, I don't think I'd be afraid to or you know compete against another person in that sense.
Yeah.
Um, no.
I have a question for all of you. Let's start with Soumya. Are you there?
She's being safe.
You calls and I think most Zoom calls and online kind of calls, the first 5 minutes is spent on figuring out if everyone is there, if they can hear each other, if they can see each other. So yeah, I'm glad we're kind of living that. But okay, since Sonia is not responding, Debbie, do you think you are vulnerable? And
Yes.
maybe as two different people, as an individual to your friends and to your maybe social life and to your colleagues at work.
It's a very, very interesting question, actually. Hmm. I'd like to think I'm vulnerable in different ways, right? Um, like at work, it has taken me time to be able to be vulnerable. It's a little tough to answer this question in this context right now, considering Kiran, you and I have known each other many, many years, and I do call you a friend. So it's tough. But I would say I'm vulnerable in a different way. For example, like this for this episode, right? I was running late. I had to go pick up the kids because I had no help today. And I'm literally running back at breakneck speed, trying to figure out what to do with the kids, keep them to get them to keep quiet for half an hour so I can do this, webinar. And I reached out to Pooja and Soumya and said, please, guys, I need help. And that is me being vulnerable. That's me being, that's me asking,
Sure.
saying that this
Yep.
is my reality and I cannot do anything about it. I'm not going to be perfect. I'm not going to be able to bring my best self today.
Yep.
And that's how I am over here. And with friends, it's a very different equation altogether, right? I guess maybe I'm not as vulnerable as I should be with my friends. I have to think about that one.
And
I
so
want
you're
Kiran
saying
to
you're
answer.
more vulnerable at work than you are in your social life?
Oh God, no, no, I don't think so. But in a
Well,
different way. In a different way.
see, that's my point. It's
Maybe,
very tough. It's so
It's tough. It's tough.
contextual. You
It
can't
is
kind
tough.
of just say you're yeah, okay,
Yeah.
Pooja, you.
maybe it's just questioned more at the workplace. It's not like with your friends, you've probably known them for a really long time and you're not really actively asking yourself these things. But at work, you're pushing yourself to have to think about not just you, but everybody else around you as well.
Yeah.
Uh, I wanted Kiran to answer the same question that we asked you.
Um, I will. I don't have a problem. I think I'm actually more vulnerable at work than I am as a friend.
I think I agree
And
with that.
you agree with that? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Because yeah, I don't know why, but yeah, I think that's why. That's how I deal with it.
I think it takes a lot. It takes a lot to be able to talk about what's going on in your head in any environment. In the workplace, I think it's being normalized and celebrated a lot more. So we are starting to take those baby steps. I think they are still baby steps, right? We're starting to take those baby steps, trying to get the feel of things and still knowing. And it's a good thing because that means we're creating a place where it's okay to share. And I think that's TTT is an embodiment of that, right? Where we are coming and sharing. We're not experts, but we're talking about things. We're learning about things, from each other. And I think that is also being vulnerable, and yet also saying that, what, I have a lot to say, and I'm going to say it, and you're not going to judge me, right? So I think that's a good thing. Versus in your personal space, it's still an uncharted sort of territory. You can be vulnerable with some people who you've known for a while, but not with everyone else. So it's more dynamic, versus in the workplace it's a more controlled environment perhaps. And we will end with Soumya, who sent in a long comment which I will read out, where she says three of the most important things about vulnerability are: why are you sharing it as a leader? Is it to take accountability off your back? Whoa, then that's not vulnerability, I agree. Who are you being vulnerable to? There are things maybe only your immediate team needs to know, maybe the entire organization needs to know. How much are you sharing? For instance, you may just say that you have a problem because of which you may be less available for 2 days. Maybe you don't need to share what. I don't see the rest of the comment, sorry. um yeah, any responses to that? Is it to take
No,
accountability off your back, do you think? That's an interesting point.
yeah. Uh, I don't know. I mean, yeah, you've said it, so now you can't hold me responsible, kind of
Yeah.
thing, right? So,
Yeah, like for
Mm.
example, today I couldn't bring my whole self to this chat, because I had stuff happening right before. So is that me trying to shirk my responsibilities and not figuring out my life and just being there and being professional and making it work? It's a good question.
It is.
It's a
I
good
guess
question.
if it's done for a particular reason, then you can question it. If
Mm,
it's done in the general course of work and of a banter and of sharing or whatever it may be, then maybe not.
mm,
But yeah, it's a tough one.
yeah,
But there's also Benita's comment which says, when you become too vulnerable, it can lead them to wondering if you're reliable, which is pretty much what I was saying right at the beginning, which
yeah,
is that you have to have a boundary as a leader as well, because you as a captain of a sinking ship, you can't just panic all the way, because that's not going to help in people deboarding and everything smoothly. So yeah.
yeah. This was a really, really good chat, I think. And, we've kind of defined that it's a good thing, but it's always contextual. I think that's what it comes down to. And also, we've kind of defined that by showing vulnerability, especially at the leadership level, you're creating a psychologically safe workplace, which is extremely important, and it leads to many, many benefits, which can be measured in terms of ROI. I know you love that one, Kiran. But ultimately, it leads to productivity, belonging, a better culture, more positive culture, which will automatically lead to hopefully things like reduced attrition and reduced absenteeism or even presenteeism for that matter, right? Because everyone is working together towards something and bringing their whole selves to work. On that note, we shall wrap this up. Any final words from anyone?
No, thank you. This was excellent.
Great. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. Please keep joining us every other Thursday for Tidy Tea Time. The topic will be up on LinkedIn very soon, so look out for that. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.